Hello, everybody. Welcome to the T1 show. I'm your host, Tinas Ferreira, and today I'm super excited to be joined by Joe from the F1 Club. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you very much, mate. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you. I think it's going to be a great chat. I think we have a very nice, interesting, controversial topic lined up for today. We're going to talk about, we have Max Verstappen on the one side, we have Charles Leclerc on the other side. Two young prodigies, two guys tipped to win the championship in the future, guys to revitalize or revive the sport, and the rivalry is expected to, set things alight in the coming years. And I thought today is the perfect opportunity for the two of us maybe to put our minds together and have a bit of a think about, between the two of them at this point in time, just as we're getting the 2020 season started, how do they stack up against each other? Who's the better driver at this moment in time, and who do we think has the most potential going forward as well? So I think, Joe, let's maybe get right into it. And for the listeners out there, we're going to talk through a couple of different categories. We've segmented a driver's capabilities into a couple of different spheres. The first being qualifying, the second being racecraft, the third being race pace and management, fourth being mental strength, and then lastly, the team that they have around them. So, Joe, let's maybe get into qualifying. How do you think the two stack up against each other over one lap?
So, I think with the qualifying thing, I think the only way we can fairly judge it is by talking about 2019. The reason I say that is just because, Max has been in that Red Bull a while, and Charles has only had that 1 year in a car that can compete with a Red Bull or a Mercedes or at the front of the grid. So I think if we look at last season as a starting point, obviously, Charles had his moments in his junior series parts of his career in terms of qualifying pace and race pace, but on the qualifying front, for me, last season, I think it's, looking at the figures, Charles was head and shoulders quicker over one lap than Max. But what's interesting is if Max was in that same car, I just feel like it would be a very even playing ground. I think that the problems more come for Max when it comes to qualifying with the car that he's in. Obviously, the car is set up for him. It's pretty much built around what he needs. Red Bull invests a lot of resource into making Max Verstappen a fast driver, but something's just not working for them. I don't know if that's all going to come together this season. Obviously, he had his best championship finish last year, so we'll see. But hopefully, we'll see Max a little bit further up the grid. But for me, Charles really outshone a lot of people in the qualifying last year. I think if I'm not mistaken, he was actually the qualified with the most poles last season.
Yeah. I think he got 7.
7, yeah. So, and the next closest is Hamilton with 5. So, arguably, Charles is the best on the grid over one lap at the minute. If you just take that one sample. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think Charles, to stand out, I think area or aspect of his season last year was his qualifying. Like, I think he pulled so many brilliant laps out of the bag. I think he outqualified Vettel by 7/10 in Spa, which is insane because we know Vettel isn't. He's a handy qualifier as well, and his Singapore quali lap as well I thought was quite spectacular. I mean, he was sort of on the limits, on the point of losing control, but he held it together and actually put it on pole still despite all of his having around lap. So I think at this point in time, I'm inclined to say that Charles is probably the better qualifier out of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, I think, as you said, he had the car under him more than what Max had. But I think Max also had a couple of scrappy laps last year and it maybe wasn't shown as much, on TV per se, but I think there were quite a few examples where he dropped a 10th here, dropped a 10th there, and then he maybe wasn't as high up as he could have been. Conversely, his laps in Hungary and Mexico were very, very good. I think maybe even excellent if you take into account that he probably didn't have the best car on the day and he still put it on pole. So I think that would be my feeling. I would say both incredibly strong, but probably giving Charles at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, Max 100% has the ability to be the fastest on the grid on his day, with the car underneath him, and on the right track on the right day. Absolutely has the ability. But just going back to that point about Leclerc out qualifying Vettel by 7 tenths. Now, let's not forget, Ferrari had the straight line speed all weekend, on that particular weekend. And when it came to the race, their lap times were very similar for the large proportion. So that just shows you how fast that lap was, because
Yeah.
it's we all know that Seb has the ability to put cars on pole position. He's done it all the way through his career. But for Leclerc to not only dominate, but dominate 7 tenths is dominating in qualifying.
Yeah.
In
No, that's
qualifying,
like a beating.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
like a proper spanking.
Exactly. So in qualifying terms, to turn over your teammate on your first season in a Ferrari, on his second season in Formula One, and it be by 7 tenths, that's impressive for me. So yeah, I'd have to agree. Charles, for me, is the better qualifier.
Cool. Okay, let's maybe leave it at that and move on to our next category, which is racecraft. So this to me is an interesting one. I want to hear your thoughts first before I give my 2 cents.
Yeah. So look, I'll start with Max. Okay, Max has had a long time to develop his skills. He's had a lot of backing, and he's made a lot of mistakes. And only now does it really feel like he's learning from the mistakes that he makes. And only now does it really feel like he's really in a position where he could genuinely challenge for a title. Some people say that it's a little bit hasty to say that Max has the ability to challenge for a title because, Red Bull have had some reliability and engine issues over the years. And, Max has had his issues of his own, but his racecraft is incredible, And, I mean, let's look at the direct comparison of Leclerc versus Max last season. We saw it a couple of times. And like you said at the start of this podcast, their rivalry is expected to light things up. And the reason people think that is because of the battles that have happened on track so far between these two guys, and Max came out on top. In terms of racecraft for Charles Leclerc, though, he can't be underestimated either. I feel like there is still so much more of Charles Leclerc to see, and this is where I'm sort of like, at the moment, Max edges Charles on racecraft for me. But the thing about Charles Leclerc is, I'm not sure if you know this, but in Formula 2, he once pitted in a sprint race, which is pretty much unheard
Yeah,
of.
was the Bahrain one, right?
Yeah, and he
Yeah.
had I think it was maybe 9 laps to go, and he pitted in a sprint race, and that's literally unheard of in a Formula 2 sprint race. You just stay out and try and hold positions if your tyres are gone. But yeah, he chose to pit, freshen up his tyres, and I think he came out of the pits in 16th or 14th, and he finished first.
Yeah,
That
it's
so,
crazy.
which is a direct display of his racecraft. Now, there is an argument that racecraft can't necessarily be completely carried over into Formula One because of all of the elements of Formula One that aren't in Formula Two, such as strategies with ERS and that sort of thing. But Charles definitely has the potential, and the rate that he is developing at is a little bit scary.
Yeah.
In my opinion. So for me, Max edges it at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if Charles, by the end of this season, is stronger on the racecraft front.
Yeah, I think again agree with everything that you said there. Maybe I can add one or two things. I think last year there were, and similar to how Max was maybe 2, 3 years ago, I think there were times where Charles was a bit, I felt, heavy-handed in his on-track battles. Maybe
Yeah.
efficient and effective still, but not like, I think if the cards fell a different way, it could have been didn't couldn't have could have ended worse for him. I think
Yeah.
even, the obvious example to me was obviously Suzuka, where he actually drove into Max around, was it turn one, where, Max was basically had to retire after a couple of laps. That was the one example to me where I thought Charles was maybe a bit heavy-handed. And even Monza, where he defended against Hamilton, I thought, and I'm actually interested to hear your thoughts on that one, but I think if what he did there in defense against Hamilton wasn't at Monza, probably could have ended differently. Maybe with a bit of a penalty, but so
Yeah.
that's why I'm thinking, like, I think sometimes he's maybe a bit impulsive still in how he goes about his racing. But again, not a bad thing necessarily, just I think room for improvement, and he still has, as you said, so much to give. And it's only been it's his second year in F1, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, going back to that, I agree. He can be quite heavy-handed, and at Monza, I feel like if Lewis hadn't managed to get his car under control after the incident, I think there would have been a penalty
Mm.
infringement. I think it's only that Lewis managed to pull it together and stay so close to Charles that there was no infringement, and I don't think they wanted to repeat the whole situation that happened at
The
Canada
the the
because.
Seb Vettel thing, yeah.
Yeah, so I think there was an element of that going on, but there's also you know there was an incident between himself and Seb as well on track, and there was an argument about whether one or the other was too hasty and who had the correct track positioning, and these are things that where Max has an advantage because of his experience more than anything. Charles, like I said, he's got time to develop, time to learn, and I think it is his experience that makes him that impulsive driver that we're sort of talking about.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that you said there. And I think this sort of leads us into the next section, which is race pace and management. And I guess this is more the tire management, as you mentioned, the ERS management, general strategy and execution of races in that sense.
Hmm.
How do you rate the two?
So it's difficult because for me, Max edges it, and the reason I say that is because you know when Max is in the car, he seems very much like he's in control himself. He doesn't depend on his race engineers so much. Although, his race engineer, he's got a very good relationship with his race engineer, but he doesn't seem to depend on him too much. He seems to say, I've got this, leave me alone. I can do this. I'm fine. He's shown, he's very capable driver in the wet. He's put in some fantastic lap times in the race with, full tanks of fuel and all the rest of it. And his ERS deployment is strong as well. He's between ERS and DRS. He's always finding ways to make up those seconds to get himself within the 1 second he needs to be within to get that DRS open and make the passes he needs to make. And that's pretty much what he did to Charles last year. It was a case of him catching Charles on a better set of tyres. Using his ERS effectively to get into DRS range, and then DRS opened up, and Max went around the. I believe he went around the inside, pushing Charles out
Yeah.
slightly, if I remember correctly. But even if Charles had defended that corner, Max would have had him in the next zone. So yeah, Max sort of edges it, and it's a difficult one again because, like I say, it is a matter of just judging them on the two drivers on the 1 year we've seen them in cars that can compete with each other. So yeah, and the other thing is Max at the moment, he's at a point where he's very much developed into a driver that, in the right car could be a serious challenger. And if Red Bull can offer him that, then we're looking at somebody that Lewis Hamilton's worried about, not just Charles
Yeah.
Leclerc. So it all depends on car, which we'll discuss later, I'm sure. But yeah, for me, Max edges it, and that's nothing against Charles. Charles manages his tyres very well. He's got very, very strong communication skills when it comes to talking to Ferrari about what's going on in the car. There have been times where he's sort of said, I'm not sure if I've got any damage. Can you check it? I can't feel anything, and that sort of thing. And these are all very early signs of someone that really has the ability to take the wheel on their own, which is sort of what Max is
Yeah, and
doing
sort
at the
of
minute.
sort of think about more than one thing at one time. And I think that's we've also seen like the really great drivers are sort of able to micromanage a lot of things at the same time and think about a lot of things at the same time. And I think both of them have shown that ability to sort of think big picture, even though they may be, going wheel to wheel, someone's within DRS range, they're still thinking about tires or strategy or pit stops or so I agree with that definitely. And I think with Charles, what we've also seen that's impressed me last year was how quickly he's been picking up things. I think he realized quite early on, maybe compared to Vettel, maybe not as strong in the races yet. Vettel was catching him out later on. I think Hungary was a prime example where, Leclerc was basically in the lead the whole race, and then last couple of laps, because Vettel managed his race better, he actually and got one over him. And I think there we've seen Charles actually improve quite a lot over the last couple of races. And I think that's just going to improve even more as he gets experience, because it's easy to forget Max has been in the car since 2015. So last year was it his fourth season in F1?
Yes.
So I think that's like I think a big advantage in terms of, learning how to deal with all of these things over time.
Yeah, I think the other thing, going on to the development of Charles, his ability to recognize race strategy is really good. I feel like that's one of his strong points is, discussing race strategy in advance of the race, deciding, plan A, plan B, plan C with the engineers and the team, and making that work. Obviously, we've seen a little bit of commotion on that front because, they've made strategies and Seb's been a little bit, not necessarily giving over to the strategies, but Leclerc's shown an understanding of quite advanced strategies that lead to undercuts, overcuts, and all the rest of it. And I really do think that the longer he sits in that Ferrari seat, the more and more experienced he gets, the closer he gets to a championship. I think we are seeing a championship driver, a championship winning driver when we look at Charles Leclerc. And that's where Max is interesting, because Max is a championship winning driver, but he needs the car. He really needs the car. Whereas I feel like no matter what car Charles is in, eventually he's going to achieve a world title. And it's just I think that's kind of like more of an aura thing, like Charles just radiates world champion for me, and that's a personal thing rather than a fact or
where it feels like a Max has like been, how can I say, Max has been like built to be a world champion, where Charles feels like he's sort of, just has that sort of champion's aura about him. So that's actually a good point. I haven't thought about it like that yet, and I tend to agree with that. I think maybe this can lead us into the next section, which is mental strength, and this is something that I wanted to pose to you about Max specifically, because I think, a lot of people have been jumping up and down, especially this season, about, Max, this is Max's year, the changes to the calendar and this whole situation around all of the changes and compromises that had to be made. This is going to suit Max to a T. The first three tracks that they're going to be driving at is Max Verstappen special tracks, and he loves it there, and he's probably going to set himself up for a championship. And I have always been of the opinion that, listen, we know Max is a brilliant driver, and we know he has this talent and he has this ability, but it's a completely different mental game to fight for a championship compared to, taking a chance or snatching a race win every now and again. And that's what we've seen Max doing over the last couple of years. When the opportunity presented itself, and when the Red Bull got the strategy right, Max took the win where they can. But when you now have to start managing mentally a championship from beginning to end with that pressure, with thinking big picture, not only thinking I want to win this race, what do you make of that? Do you think that's something that Max is going to be able to deal with easily, or is that something he's going to have to think about?
I think this is going to be a really interesting one. And my reasoning for that is because how he handles it all depends on how Red Bull handle things this season, I think, because, there's, like you say, there is a quite a large bit of momentum behind Max to start the season well. And if he does start the season well, let's say he wins the first 2 or 3 races of the season, just hypothetically, the pressure's instantly on him then. He might be ahead, but he's got a 6-time world championship champion driver in Lewis Hamilton breathing down his neck. And if that car isn't up to scratch one weekend, how's he going to handle that pressure? How's he going to handle having a car that can't quite, get those lap times that Mercedes can put in, and still find a way to get the points in and not lose his head and get frustrated at, reliability issues or any of the rest of it. Now, obviously, that is all based on reading Red Bull from the last few years. We don't know. Red Bull could have invested a serious amount over the course of, the pre-season and later stages of last year, developing a car that doesn't have these issues with Honda. Developing a car that can put Max in a position, and Max might feel very comfortable. He might be in a position now where he's saying, you know what, I drove that car at testing and I know what it's capable of and I know what I'm capable of, so game on. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Max handles this season as a whole. All the changes with, the media is going to be different, the podium situation's different, everything's going to be different. In the paddock, things are going to be different. There's going to be bubbles, who can spend time with who, this, that, and the other. Who knows, the social aspect might affect them. So, on that front, Max has to show his mental resolve. And I don't think we've seen his mental resolve to the point that we need to see it for him to win a title at this point. So I think he's got a point to prove on that front this season, to be honest. But this is, again, where there's going back to this whole natural thing that we were talking about with Charles has overcome a lot of mental barriers on his way to Formula One. The loss of his godfather, Jules Bianchi. I believe that he lost his father last year before a race as well. He's had a lot of knockbacks when he was in GP3, GP2. And he's come through all of it, hasn't he? He's come through all of it, shown he's mentally a very strong individual for his age. He's shown a massive amount of maturity for his age, and the amount of time he's been driving at the top level. I think it's a tough one because I don't think Max's, mental resolve can be measured yet. Because he does seem to mentally change every season. His mindset seems to tune in more and more as the years go on. And the more he works with Red Bull, it just tunes in more and more. Whereas Charles, again, sort of just has that aura about him where it just feels like he's relaxed and ready to take on challenges.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing with Max. And I was just thinking about it now. Max hasn't been in a proper championship fight in many years. Like, I think since F3. Mm-hmm. And he actually didn't even end up winning the championship. But, because he was lifted out of F3 straight into the Toro Rosso at that point, I think this is maybe the one area where Charles is maybe a bit more experienced than Max, given that, Charles fought for the GP3 championship campaign, the F2 championship campaign. Charles is actually much more used to dealing with, I think, sort of a season and, thinking about, the title than what somebody like Max is, who, he had 1.5 years at Toro Rosso where he was sort of just introduced to F1, then put into the Red Bull, where the Red Bull over the last couple of years, they haven't really been in the championship conversation. So again, just having that mental consideration of how Max is going to deal with the week on week pressure, I think is going to be very interesting to see. And I think this is maybe where, for me, Charles gets one over him at this point. Just with the experience and the backgrounds that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree with that, to be honest. I think, Max has to decide what route he wants to go down this season very early. He needs to say to himself right now, okay, I'm going to challenge for the title, and if we come to hurdles, I'm going to overcome them, because the thing is, we're not measuring his mental resolve in Austria or at the stronger tracks, because we know he's strong there. It's going to be when we come to these tracks where Mercedes are always strong, Ferrari are always strong, and Red Bull regularly suffer. When we get to those tracks and there's, the psychological barrier of previous seasons and things that have gone wrong there, that's when we're going to be talking, like we're looking at tracks like Spa. tracks, these Monza, these straight line speed tracks, Red Bull don't tend to, dominate at these tracks. And, Max has made some mistakes in the past, and he's got to brush it all out of his head, sort of see this as a clean slate this season, and just believe in the car. But like you say, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how Max handles a proper title challenge, and the pressure that comes with competing with the likes of Lewis Hamilton and genuinely competing with him.
Yeah, no, agree. So let's maybe move on to the final aspect of these two, which is their respective teams. So again, this to me is an interesting one, and you've alluded to, Red Bull just not having the car ready for Max to really fight for a championship yet. Now this year, there's been whispers, there's been rumors that Red Bull are actually sitting on quite a strong car, a car that they think can take it to Mercedes, where on Ferrari's end, quite the opposite, where it sounds like Ferrari actually regressed relative to Mercedes and Red Bull compared to 2019. Now, to me, that poses an interesting question, and especially given that both Max and Charles signed super long-term commitments to Red Bull and Ferrari respectively to be part of that team. And I want to throw this to you maybe. What do you think would it do to both of them mentally if this trend continues of them, sort of being the nearly guys, the guys that almost got there, or the guys in the second or third fastest car on the grid, but not actually getting the results that they really want?
I think, listen, it's a difficult question to answer because Mercedes are so dominant. When we look at Formula One history, they are probably the most dominant team in the history of Formula One. If not, up there. The things they're producing, the level of engineering that they've got within that team is incredible. And Red Bull is a drinks brand. They've got a massive budget, yes, and they've got a great set of great staffing and great resources and all of this, but they are a drinks brand competing with one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world, a team that know how to create a good road car and a good race car. But I think for Red Bull, it's all about, if they are sitting on this car that we're hearing about, it's about them being very vigilant to what Mercedes are doing, dropping updates on the same weekends that Mercedes are, and that these small packages and little things that these teams are bringing to race weekends may make the difference. Because and it is a big if Red Bull are sitting on a car that can genuinely compete with Mercedes, and Ferrari are competing with a car that can genuinely compete with Mercedes, which at the moment we're not sure if they are, we've potentially got a six car world championship battle. And that for me is more where it's like, how do these guys psychologically deal with it? Because if you've genuinely got, if Red Bull have genuinely got two cars in the championship fight for the majority of the season, and they end up being the nearly guys again, they're gonna say, what have we got to do? We've produced a car. We've got the floor of the car right. We've sorted the engine. We've sorted the aerodynamics. We've built a car around Max Verstappen pretty much. Like, I know Alex Albon's a great driver, but let's not be facetious.
Let's not kid ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. That car has been built around how Max drives, and that's why the drivers find it difficult to drive it. But that's where the challenge comes, because it's like, if they're not competitive, then it's easy to accept. Look at McLaren. McLaren were competitive for years and years and years, and then they've accepted they're not on the pace anymore. Things have changed, and they're going through a rebuild process. And that's the difference, is accepting that you're in a rebuild process rather than a title competing space. If Red Bull are in a title competing space this year and they don't quite get it, who knows? They could. Red Bull could make very drastic changes. They could say, okay, let's just continue doing what we're doing and hope for the best. But Max is going to be saying to himself, this was the one. This was the year. This was the year that everyone was saying I was going to do it. And then the other thing you've got to remember is every year that goes by for Max, Some of these younger guys are catching up. George Russell, for example,
Yeah.
he's hotly tipped to be something awesome. I was very impressed with him in Formula 2. He was absolutely stunning to watch. And I feel really sorry for him because of the car he's had for Formula 1. But if he gets in that Mercedes and Max Verstappen hasn't won a title yet,
Mm,
it could be a never situation for Max, because I really do feel that once George is in a car that's quick enough, he'll be dominant. Um, so I think that's a psychological factor for Max. Is those younger guys that are catching up with him in terms of experience, and he's committed to Red Bull. This is the thing, he's committed to Red Bull for such a long time. His options are sort of closed. If Red Bull don't produce the car that he's hoping, um,
yeah.
what happens to
So
Max?
that to me is the interesting thing. And so when I read at the beginning of the year, because you remember at the start, I mean, all of us were sort of really hotly anticipating silly season and the transfers and the sort of the teams battling for the drivers, because everybody was out of contract at the end of the year. So I was actually very surprised when, Ferrari locked down till 2024 and Max was locked down soon after till 2023. From Max and Charles's perspective, more than, from the team's perspective, because I think the teams have everything to gain in keeping those two drivers locked in till, the mid 2020s. But I don't understand, especially from Charles's perspective. And I think he was also sort of lost in the romanticism of Ferrari. But if I was Charles, I would have thought to myself, okay, Ferrari hasn't won a championship since what, 2008, when they
Yeah,
last won the constructors.
yeah.
To put myself in a 5-year contract with the team, I mean, that to me would be a big commitment. And I know it's an honor to drive for Ferrari, and I know, all of the history and all of that. But I just think from a purely logical perspective, if I was Charles and I knew what a hot property I was at the moment, why would I sign for such a long period of time? So I didn't get that, but I guess happy to be convinced otherwise.
I think you know what I think it is. I think it's when you've had such a rapid rise in motorsport like Charles has had. He's come up very fast. He come out of the Sauber or Alfa Romeo, whatever you want to call it, and walked straight into Ferrari and dominated his teammate at Ferrari. And I think, you know, there is an element of being naive. Even though we talk about him being an absolutely excellent driver, which he is, he's probably thought to himself, because let's not forget, Ferrari was the dream for Jules Bianchi. And I think that's part of Charles's obsession with Ferrari is that he sort of feels like he's doing it for both of them. But um, I think the thing with it is he's seen it as an opportunity to be guaranteed to stay in Formula One till a certain point, or and do it in a competitive car. So yeah, Ferrari may not have won a title for 12 years or whatever it is, but they're somewhere near every year, and Charles may feel that he is the driver that will put them back at the
Yeah.
top. He's very, very mentally strong, so he could heavily back himself and say, you know what, I'll commit to this program. As for Max was always going to, because Red Bull have given him too much not to commit his. I think he'll probably be there for his entire career.
Yeah, but I
Uh,
mean Red Bull as well, like they are desperate to keep Max. I mean, I've been joking over the last couple of episodes on my show, just like about Helmut Marko and his obsession with Max Verstappen, but like literally they bend over backwards. Anything that Max wants, they'll give him. I think because they also realize, I think, what they have in him, and
mhm.
that there has been whispers or rumors in the last couple of years that Mercedes has been sniffing around Max, maybe
Yeah.
wanting to sign him, and Red Bull has just been adamant, like they will not let go of Max Verstappen. And I agree with you, probably going to stay there for a long while still, except as with what happened to Vettel, if you realize, at a point, listen, I don't even have a shot at a championship, never mind winning a race, and then maybe you might pick up sticks and leave.
Mm. I think the I think the rumours around the whole Max and Mercedes thing it's more to do with the fact that when Lewis stops winning, he'll just retire because he's such a successful driver. You know, he's about to
Yeah, he
become.
doesn't have to spend,
Yeah,
driving around in fourth or fifth. It doesn't give
exactly.
anything to him. Yeah.
So once he's he's achieved all his dreams already. If he matches Michael Schumacher's record, he'll be a very happy man. There's a big amount of potential that he could beat Michael Schumacher's record with the regulations staying the same for as long as they are. At that point he could say, right, I've won more world titles than anybody else. I can walk away now. And at that point, Mercedes go, okay, we replace Bottas with George Russell. Who's our other guy? Because Mercedes like to have two championship contenders. They're one of these teams. They don't have like Red Bull are happy to have Max as the championship contender and the second driver as the support driver that brings in constructors points. Whereas Mercedes' mentality is, look, I don't care who wins that world title, just one of you go out
As
and win
long as
that
you
world
win it,
title.
yeah.
Yeah. So they're looking for a driver that's got the capability, and fans know, and I'm sure Mercedes know that Max has got that ability in the right car. But as Charles Leclerc has as well. Who knows? Who knows who's going to replace Hamilton when that comes around? But I think that's where those rumours came from around sort of Mercedes sniffing around Max, because he's one of the only drivers on the grid that could be the caliber for Mercedes if Lewis was to retire.
Yeah, no, I see that. I'm just thinking about, Verstappen and Russell in the same team, and it's giving me stress just thinking about, what could potentially happen there. But
Yeah.
I would love to see that, to be honest. Don't know how likely that is, but anyway. So Joe, before we sign off, I think we've gone on a bit longer than we expected. Before we sign off, so for the 2020 season in the same car, who would come out on top at the end, Max or Charles?
Max.
Max. I agree. I think if we have the same conversation next year, I think I might give you a different answer. But I think
exactly. Yeah.
this year I'm gonna say Max. And I think we can maybe end it off there. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time, for joining the conversation. We're happy to have you on many more times over the year and the remaining season. So knowledgeable and super interesting to talk to. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, mate. Thank you
and to everybody listening, we're recording this just before the season starts, so we are hyped, we are amped, we are ready for things to kick off. Can't wait for things to get going finally. And I'll be back with a little bit of a race review at the end of the Austrian Grand Prix, so look out for that. And please hit the subscribe button if you guys do feel so inclined. And I'll check you guys next time.
Thank you.